Welcome back to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. I'm John Paul Niven.
And I'm Martin Jones. Have you ever wondered what happens to your body when you don't get enough sleep? Well, today we're diving into the world of sleep deprivation with Dr. Allison Brager.
After about 18 to 24 hours of extended wakefulness with no opportunities to rest, that individual can no longer recover their physiological performance, cognitive or emotional performance without some sleep opportunity.
Allison's pioneering research is revealing remarkable insights into the relationship between our genes, brains, and behavior.
People who have a naturally occurring mutation in the adenosine 2A receptor are resilient to sleep deprivation, meaning under conditions of forced wakefulness, their rate of physiological, cognitive, emotional decline is slower.
We explore how sleep, or the lack of it, affects performance, why some people resist sleep loss, and strategies to survive and thrive in high-stakes, sleep-deprived environments.
If you just give 20 minutes in a day for someone to take a nap and or just lie on the ground, close their eyes, just 20 minutes of chill time, you're going to be far more productive. And then also you're going to naturally increase the happiness, the mood, the morale, and the welfare of this unit.
Allison, welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful fall, crisp morning over here.
Awesome. I'd love to say the same here in the UK, but at the moment it's just rain, and more rain, but hey-ho. Allison, it'd be brilliant if you could give us an intro to yourself, your background, where you've come from, and what you're currently doing.
Yeah, so I'm an active duty Army officer. The Army likes to refer to me as a research psychologist, even though I really have no formal training in psychology. My background is in neuroscience. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I have essentially looked at the relationship between genes, brain, and behavior for the last 15 years of my career. And as part of that work, I've specifically worked with military units, a lot of our higher tier units, where we've integrated clinical trials that we've completed in the lab and then have applied this work into operational training settings to help develop knowledge products and material solutions for the government.
Thanks, Alison. That's interesting already. The neuroscientist being labelled a psychologist, it's usually the other way around. We usually find people who've got no neuroscience background who are sometimes called as a neuroscientist. So that's an interesting start that's how it happens over in the US.
Yeah, there's a few of us like that. They're like, oh, yeah, you're a psychologist. I'm like, nope, not at all. Sorry.
I first came to know about you through reading your research around sleep. And you've done quite a lot of stuff around sleep and fatigue. And one of the things that I'm asked a lot around sleep is about what sleep restriction actually does. So when you don't get enough sleep, what happens? Now, that's really common in high stress, high stakes environments because these people just don't sleep very much. You get occupational sleep loss because of the nature of the job. So based on your experience, can you tell us what happens when you don't get enough sleep?
Yeah, so we've looked at this cognitively, physiologically, and then emotionally. So a lot of the work that we've done in laboratory settings mimics the operational environment of high stakes, high stress military personnel. For example, in most of our sleep deprivation studies, we're looking at two different types of experiments. We're either looking at acute sleep deprivation, where we force people to stay awake for 2, sometimes close to 3 days. And so what we're essentially doing is we're looking at the rate of decline in physiological, cognitive, and emotional endpoint measures. We typically find under conditions of acute sleep deprivation that after about 18 to 24 hours of extended wakefulness with no opportunities to nap or to rest, that's the tipping point, and that individual can no longer recover their physiological performance, cognitive or emotional performance without some sleep opportunity, whether it be a nap or a rested night of sleep. The other situation that we look at, and this is the one that's more common and also more pervasive in some of the units we work with, is chronic sleep deprivation. So chronic sleep deprivation is essentially when you are receiving 70% or less of your required sleep needs day after day for a period of weeks, months, years. Now, in the laboratory setting, we're looking at this within a 2-week, sometimes even 1-week time frame. So essentially, we're recruiting people who normally sleep 7 to 8 hours, have normal, healthy sleep, and now only giving them a 5-hour sleep opportunity at night with no opportunities to nap during the day. And one of the things we find in those situations is it doesn't matter what the endpoint measure is, whether it's physiological performance, cognitive or emotional performance, that 3 days is the tipping point. And what I mean is at 3 days, there's such a decline in their physiological, their cognitive, and their emotional state that it starts approaching clinically significant levels. So the best example I could give of this are like the classic testosterone studies that were done. A lot of this work was done 30, 40 years ago by Dr. Ev von Carter at the University of Chicago, where she recruited young, healthy males to her lab who normally slept 8 hours. And 3 days into these young, healthy males sleeping only 5 hours, their nighttime secretion of testosterone and circulating levels of testosterone decreased to about 50% of baseline levels. And they continued to stay at 50% until these young, healthy males had the opportunity to sleep. Well, we've actually done like testosterone characterization studies. This is all published in some of our most highly valued operational units. And we have found similar things where as they're switching, for example, from like daytime to nighttime operations, that you see similar drops in testosterone that are concerning because they are clinically significant.
We could stop there. There you go. Key message. There you go. You know, it makes me smile because I remember talking to somebody who'd worked in this environment for a long, long time, and they just said, all you need to do is go in there and tell them that sleep loss will lower their testosterone and you've won them over.
Yep.
And I think it's true. In certain environments where, you know, let's be honest, some of these people want extra testosterone. You know, sometimes they're asking around supplementation or pharmacological testosterone. And the reality is optimize sleep and you're probably going to get equal effects, if not greater effects than taking synthetic testosterone. So great to hear. I'm really glad you brought that one up. I found it interesting talking to people who go into these acute phases of sleep restriction, like say that 24 hours of forced wakefulness and the stories of hallucinations. Now, I've had individuals telling me that they've been marching along with a member of Lord of the Rings next to them, or they've seen their long dead relative riding a bike past them, or things like that. Some weird and wonderful things happen when you don't get enough sleep.
Yeah, I can attest to that. During the war, we would go out and do these mental health assessments of conventional large combat arms units. And so when we went out with them outside the wire of our compound, we ended up being awake for about 70 hours straight. Because by the time they did this live fire training exercise, did a recovery, and then came back to the compound, it's a good 2.5 days. And I remember, even though I kept myself on a strategic caffeine dosing schedule, I would say about 36 hours in, I just felt wasted. And I just stayed wasted for another 1.5 days. That's what it felt like. I didn't hallucinate, but I definitely felt very drunk.
It's funny, I was chatting to colleagues in the university and one of them came in and they said, I'm really tired. And said, your chin strapped. And they sort of looked at me, what do you mean by chin strapped? And I said, your chin strapped. And to me, that's terminology it's used in the military to describe tired, because the only thing it's keeping your head up is your chin strap in your helmet.
Yeah.
Because everyone else is walking there just feeling sorry for themselves, like nodding dog syndrome.
Yep, that's exactly what it feels like. I'm going to start using that term now.
With that in mind, do you find that some people are just more vulnerable to sleep loss? Like you said, for you, it was around about 36 hours. I've heard people having hallucinations at 20 hours of forced wakefulness. Is this something that there is variability across the population? I know you've done some research on this. What have you found in terms of that vulnerability of some people worse off?
Yeah, so this is always something that people don't like to hear. It's genetic in origin. So a lot of the work we've done have been looking at naturally occurring mutations, right? So single nucleotide polymorphisms and select genes related to circadian timing and or this homeostatic balance of sleep. So for example, one of the genetic factors we found is involved with adenosine regulation, right? And we know adenosine is the neurochemical of sleepiness. As you're awake during the day, adenosine levels in the brain accumulate, And then as soon as you fall asleep, they start dissipating. Well, people who have a naturally occurring mutation in the adenosine 2A receptor, so the 2A receptor is what caffeine binds to, right? That is what creates the psychoactive properties of caffeine to maintain wakefulness. We find that those individuals are resilient to sleep deprivation, meaning they're similar to me. I don't know if I have this mutation in my receptor, but I can imagine I do. And that under conditions of forced wakefulness, their rate of physiological, cognitive, emotional decline is slower. 2 days in, everyone is operating the same level, right? Everyone is chin strapped, if you will. But
Love the use of the lingo.
yeah,
Love it.
exactly. I'm going to use this now. But in that declining period, they do show resiliency. We can't do these studies in the US anymore because it requires a great deal of approval. And in fact, it requires approval of the Secretary of War to do like genotype studies. We were doing these as part of like a defense research development program aimed towards identifying unique genetic polymorphisms and how those correlate with military performance. But we found with this particular mutation that if you look at the frequency of this mutation in operational units, and again, this is all publicly available, published data, it's actually higher than what you would expect in the general population. So it goes back to this idea, and I know a lot of people don't want to hear it, but there's nature versus nurture. Selection to me, especially those very demanding, prolonged assessment and selections for select units, it is essentially finding people with the genetic traits that map onto the jobs that are required of them. You know, it's not to dismiss talent and hard work because talent and hard work matter. But if you have the talent and the hard work and you meet all those criteria for certain attributes, and then you happen to have the right genetic traits, then you're good. It's the same way with like NBA players, right? It's a requirement to be tall to play for the most part in the NBA. If you are genetically programmed to be 5'4", 5'5", you'd be a great gymnast, but you're not going to be a great basketball player, you know?
Yeah.
Alison, curiosity question. If resilience to sleep deprivation is genetic, if someone is sleep deprived for a long period of time or for short periods, is there any evidence suggesting an epigenetic change to make individuals more resilient to a lack of sleep or poor quality sleep, or are we not there yet?
So we've actually found the opposite. We found that there's epigenetic changes to be less resilient. There is evidence out there that with repeated exposure to acute sleep deprivation and certainly chronic sleep deprivation, it increases DNA methylation and certain RNA, DNA factors that make you less resilient because now you're dealing with the compounding effects of methylation. As an example, we did a TBI study. It should be out any day in the Journal of Biological Rhythms. We looked at American football players, not at the highest tier schools, but at lower tier colleges. And we found that even in those populations, a single concussion causes epigenetic changes and factors that regulate the circadian clock and the need for sleep in a manner where these individuals are far less resilient during sleep deprivation. They may have been medically cleared from their concussion, but now when they're re-exposed to 24 hours of sleep deprivation, they cannot function. A lot of the self-reported symptoms of their concussion return. And then when you look at tests of attention and vigilance, that they cannot sustain the attention and vigilance of someone who did not have a concussion. And so those epigenetic changes seem to also be present in healthy individuals that were exposed to sleep deprivation. So great question.
Every now and then, JP pulls out a good question. It's, as they say, even a blind squirrel finds a nut occasionally. There you go, JP.
No stress inoculation ones yet.
No, not yet, not yet. For me, that's, again, a really interesting thing. So I think sleep fragmentation or sleep problems, we see that a lot with people who've had head knocks. People with head injuries often have sleep problems. Coming back to what happens to people when they are sleep deprived over a prolonged period, one of my challenges is the belief that continual exposure to sleep deprivation somehow trains you to need less sleep. I often will push back and say the evidence isn't particularly great for that.
Yeah.
Can you lean into that? Can you train people to sleep less?
Yeah, I don't think you can. We've done a study with ultra marathon runners. It's a highway that you run on 100 miles north of Key West. Key West, Florida is mile zero. If you've ever seen Forrest Gump, remember when he runs to like mile zero? So this is where this ultra marathon ends, and it starts 100 miles out on the highway. And it's usually in May. So it's already pushing 100 some degrees, 100% humidity, and these individuals run this 100-mile race. Well, we've done biomarker capture as well as looking at the relationship between their race pace and their internal circadian time to show how the circadian clock is influencing the highs and lows of race pace. The other thing we've done too is subjective self-report of chronotype. So are these people a morning or evening people? We find that most of these ultra marathoners are morning people. And then in addition to that, they self-report they usually sleep 6, maybe 7 hours a night, which begs this question, are they pre-selecting or is this a trained physiological response? And the reason I say that is because if we think about strength and conditioning, as you know, I do have a background in this because I did spend some time as a professional athlete. So like I know a thing or two about strength and conditioning and training, even if I don't have any certifications in it. But one of the things that happens when you become a highly trained elite athlete is efficiency of these metabolic systems. And we know that one of the functions of sleep is maintaining energy homeostasis, which essentially means being as efficient as possible in replenishing energy reserves so that you can utilize them the next waking day. So it does make me wonder if we think about sleep as a function of energy balance, and if these individuals who are highly trained are more efficient with how they use energy, does that mean that they are physiologically more resilient to sleep deprivation because they're able to effectively utilize their energy more often, whether they're running a 100-mile race or just operating, trying to stay vigilant and cognitively alert?
So the old saying that sleep is of the brain, by the brain, for the brain, are you saying that that's maybe questionable? Is it more than just the brain?
It's definitely more than just the brain. We found that manipulation of the circadian clock, not in the brain, but in the skeletal muscle, which is going to have downstream metabolic effects on terms of basic cellular metabolism. So the production and utilization of ATP, the powerhouse of the cell, that those might be related to resiliency during sleep deprivation. And that's essentially what we found in this mouse model. And I would say there's evidence for it in humans too, because I know there was a study that came out about 10 years ago where they looked at the production of ATP during restorative sleep, during slow wave sleep in particular, which again, we know is associated with the release of growth hormone, testosterone, the clearance of waste products, the activation of the lymphatic system. And now even there's a paper that came out in Nature, the mitochondria, that's when they are most active, is during slow wave sleep. So it does make sense now that there is significant evidence that one of sleep's primary functions is to replenish ATP. And what is one of the main powerhouses of ATP outside of the brain? It's the skeletal muscle. And that's what was so fascinating about that paper is when we did those genetic manipulations in the skeletal muscle, it changed the waking EEG of these rodents. And then throughout the course of sleep deprivation, they were still able to maintain an alpha beta state in their EEG, whereas these other mice had microsleeps. But if we did the same genetic manipulations at the level of the brain, they weren't able to maintain this high frequency state of their brain activity.
Alison, just got me thinking there when you mentioned the endurance athletes down in Florida doing a 100-miler. Did you or have you noticed any trend in regards to the phenotype of athletes? So if someone is more endurance orientated, do they tend to demonstrate better resilience to a lack of sleep compared with someone who is maybe more of a gym bunny and just does a lot of strength training, for example. Is there any evidence in that regard?
That's a good point. I mean, this would just all be anecdotal in nature. And I don't know if it's a byproduct of the race or if it's just a byproduct of having heightened dopamine tone as well. But the ultra endurance athletes we worked with, it wasn't just during the race that hardly any of them had the feeling or the drive to nap. But before the race and after the race and like getting to know the ultra community over the years, when you talk about like emotional affect, they demonstrate a lot more energy and almost like pleasure for life than I would say any other athletic population I've worked with, whether it's Olympic athletes, NFL players, because most of those other sports we've worked with are more of the power-based anaerobic athlete, not the true endurance athlete. Anecdotally, I would say yes, just because of what I've seen.
It's interesting because it just made me think back to when we did the race across America. Because I've been the crew chief on that twice for two different teams. But I always just remember watching the pairs or the solo riders. Mm-hmm. And you'd catch up with them normally around Virginia. And they'd been on the road for 8 or 9 days.
Yeah.
And the vast majority present with Sherman syndrome, whereby they lose tone in their neck extensors, so their chin drops, and they've all got like cola bottles underneath their chin to keep them straight. And you look at them and you're getting no response from these guys or girls as they're riding. And it's at that point that then things can go awry. Or they cycle off a road or they cycle in the back of a car because the cognitive float's not happening.
Yeah.
You're putting yourself through it to do that, to be so sleep deprived, to keep on going. And is there something underpinning? Is it their genes? Is it their training? Is it a combination of the two?
Yeah.
Are they just crazy? That might be another factor, I think. But yeah, it was very interesting to see the sort of impact it had on those individuals.
Well, I do think there is evidence for dopamine homeostasis. Actually, we did this when I was in graduate school with hamsters. Think about hamsters in their natural state. They love to run, right? They're born to run. And there's been arguments made that humans are too. And I remember in that book, if you've ever read it, Born to Run, he talks about that Mexican tribe that not only were they ultra marathon runners, but they loved their tequila, they loved sex, and they had all these other like reward seeking behaviors that were complementary to their running in excess. And we found this in a hamster model, again, looking at dopamine tone, in that hamsters, you're going to laugh, but it's absolutely true. They actually love to drink alcohol because at least the species of hamsters we were working with, they were bred and they evolved from the desert. They would eat the fermented fruit that would be on the ground in the desert, and then they've developed enzymes in their liver that make them effective in metabolizing alcohol. So I say this because we did this study where essentially if we prevented a hamster from running on its wheel, it would then drink copious amounts of alcohol in order to maintain that dopamine homeostasis. But if they did have access to their wheel, they would have less alcohol and go towards like the thing they prefer to do most, which is to run. But I think at a certain point when you're doing periodized training in excess, and obviously we didn't do this in our hamsters, but you think about hyper ultra endurance athletes when they're keep reaching almost an allostatic, like a new set point through years of calibrated training, it's probably doing the same thing. And now this dopamine is help facilitating their vigilance and their wakefulness, because dopamine is a wakefulness producing neurochemical, just like glutamate, that it could be leading to this resiliency through periodized training. This is just a theory. I think it needs to be tested, but I think ultra marathon runners are a great population of sleep deprivation and a highly trained population, more so than anyone else out there.
Alison, when I started this podcast, I never thought I'd be talking about the drinking habits of hamsters. So this is a highlight for me already. That's awesome. If we just loop back a little bit before we talk about hamsters, the relationship between sleep and ATP production that you mentioned, the physiological basis of movement is improved by sleep. If you are physically exerting yourself and you are burning more energy and you're contracting that muscle and you're creating those different metabolic products as a result of movement, does that improve sleep? Which way round is it? Does sleep improve the ability to move, or does movement improve the ability to sleep? What are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a good one. I would argue that sleep is providing these biochemical energy reserves in order to do the things that you need to do. with training, for example. At some point during periodized training with elite athletes, you're breaking the body down and you're forcing it to utilize more energy reserves and to do these things on minimal fuel as much as possible to create these changes in energy utilization that's more allostatic than homeostatic, meaning you're trying to reach a new set point. But you need to have those biochemical energy reserves to start. So you can't train intensity unless you have the reserves available for intensity. That is one thing we do know, even with endurance training. It's not the sustained zone 2 cardiovascular output that is creating a training effect. It's the zone 4 and the zone 5. That high intensity, high exertion training requires significant biochemical energy input. You can't put that output unless you have the glucose and the fat reserves available to do that. And so that's why I would make the argument that it's sleep first, because sleep is what's going to replenish the glycogen and the fat reserves and all the biochemical analytes that are responsible and required for performing the next day.
I'm going to swing the pendulum completely the other way, Alison, to look at the practical applied impact of this. You've written that sleep is a biological foundation for readiness. So what does that fundamentally mean from an applied perspective for the individual in the ground who may be in these positions whereby they're sleep deprived?
Yeah, so it's about accountability, right? We can generate all these knowledge products about sleep and the importance of sleep, but how do we change the culture, the attitudes, and the beliefs of the soldiers on the ground to implement this? In the past, we have used fear-mongering tactics, right? Unfortunately, I have worked on fatigue-related accidents that have resulted in the cost of lives of soldiers. My friend has done the same for the Navy when there was the USS McCain and Fitzgerald, the 2 wartime naval ships that collided as a result of sleep deprivation. Beyond just using those fear-mongering tactics, you have to put the ball in their court. You have to empower them to have change. And honestly, I think that's why we've had so much success in recent years with wearables, just through giving someone a ring or a watch to monitor their sleep and to see for themselves that, oh, if I don't go to bed consistently, my recovery's bad. If I have 2 drinks in a night, then I can't get restorative sleep. There's something out there that is now holding somebody accountable for their lifestyle habits and how they impact sleep. So that's one way. And I think the other way too, and this is like the tactic we use, we teach sleep and fatigue management to incoming battalion and brigade commanders of the Army. So these are the individuals who are leading the line units. We teach them about everything we're talking about in this podcast to get them to realize if you just give 20 minutes in a day for someone to take a nap and or just lie on the ground, close their eyes, do deep breathing, just 20 minutes of chill time, you're going to be far more productive as a soldier. And then also you're just going to naturally increase the happiness, the mood, the morale, and the welfare of this unit. And yeah, if you want to take it a step further, like I did when I was in command, and create a fatigue management policy and truly train and or position your operational tempo around sleep and fatigue, that's great. But it's dead in the water if we aren't changing the culture and the attitudes and beliefs about sleep in the ground forces or any of the military forces at large.
I absolutely agree. Everything you said then, I absolutely agree with it. What I often will say when I'm presenting, trying to convince people, I say, I'm not here to tell you to stay in a 5-star hotel. You must have silk pajamas. You must have this amazing sleep opportunity, because the reality is the job won't let people do that sometimes. So what I'm trying to help people is to optimize sleep when the opportunity for sleep is sometimes suboptimal. If you are living in a dormitory or a submarine or, wherever where it's really difficult to sleep. And you mentioned that fatigue plan that you had, and you've also mentioned strategic caffeine. Maybe elaborate on some of that. What can people do if they're not able to get that optimal sleep because of the operational requirements, the imperatives that they need to stay awake because it's maybe dangerous to fall asleep in certain situations? What can we offer people who are in jobs, who are doing things like ultramarathons where they are just restricting their sleep severely because they have to? What can we do to help them?
Yeah, so we came up with, of course, like everything in the military, we've come up with an acronym. The acronym we came up with is SLANT. So those are the things, even in an operational environment, that you can control: surface, light, air quality, noise, and temperature. Something as simple as an eye mask, blocking out those horrible fluorescent lights, just like in my office right now, and maybe changing them out with red light bulbs so that when they go into their chew and their sleeping quarters, it's a better quality light. Making them wear earplugs, trying to find ways to control their body temperature. All those simple things, which have known physiological impacts, can make a difference. We've actively deployed with the units, have changed their actual sleeping environment in a lesser than optimal condition. I mean, we did that when I was deployed. Our CHU was literally right next to the flight line. So we were constantly getting interrupted at night by whatever aircrafts are coming into our compound. But our sleep would have been worse if we didn't already have those protective measures where we're using the components of surface, light, air quality, noise, and temperature.
Oh, so what would be your take on utilising like stimulants? So caffeine, for example. I remember when I was over at West Point a couple of months ago, you probably still got tons of it, that caffeinated chewing gum. It's all right, actually. It's all better than the older stuff. But what's your sort of take on utilising those sort of additional tools as part of a management strategy around issues with sleep?
I mean, I think it's a requirement in an operational environment because sleep deprivation is inevitable, right? It comes with the job. People have working class, blue collar, operational jobs where sleep deprivation is inevitable. And caffeine is the best way to protect against it if there isn't opportunities for sleep. Opportunities for sleep, even a 20-minute nap, is the primary means to maintain alertness, but taking 200 milligrams of caffeine every 4 hours until the operation or the training exercise is over is the way to go.
So with caffeine then, do you advocate taking it as you are feeling sleepy? What is the best way to take strategic caffeine?
So if you take it when you're tired, it's already too late. We created this strategic caffeine dosing app. It was a smartphone app. It was essentially a decade-long government venture to look at the direct relationship between reaction time and caffeine intake. It was first tested and evaluated in the lab, and then we transitioned it out to the field. So we actually would have units use it where as they're doing these 30, 40-hour training exercises, they would take time at regimented time points to do the reaction time test. And so we used a mathematical algorithm to come up with when you should take caffeine. And so essentially what this algorithm produced is, in order to maintain reaction time, because that's what we're looking at, is just simple reaction time vigilance, you have to have caffeine in your system every 4 hours. And the reason for that is the half-life of caffeine is anywhere from 4 to 6 hours, depending on if you're a fast metabolizer or a slow metabolizer. So as you're on that downward slope of the caffeine wearing off, that's when you replenish it so that you maintain constant levels of caffeine antagonizing of the adenosine receptors in the brain.
And does that apply if you're traveling across time zones? Like, would you advocate for using stimulants like caffeine if you were trying to avoid jet lag?
So that's actually a completely different problem, because one of the things we do know is that caffeine does block the photic phase resetting nature of light. It's a little bit more complicated when you're talking about jet lag, essentially.
Let's dive into that a little bit. You said it's affecting circadian rhythm. So we know caffeine, as you mentioned, is influencing adenosine. Mm-hmm. How is it affecting circadian rhythms? Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so essentially when you're talking about circadian rhythms, you're talking about things that are keeping the circadian rhythm on its time schedule, right? So if you have a circadian rhythm that ticks at 24.6 hours, you're keeping the phase and the period of 24.6 hours on schedule. And the only way to maintain the phase and the period is through either photic input or non-photic input that are routine and predicted, right? So the setting of the sun, the rising of the sun, the amount of light exposure in the day, if it's continuous and constant and predicted, then the circadian rhythm stays on schedule. But if you have a drug, and this is actually what I did in graduate school with alcohol and cocaine, we weren't looking at caffeine, but very similar, drugs will impact the ability of the photic information from getting to the circadian clock. And so that's why it becomes more complicated, is because the psychostimulant nature of caffeine and the adenosine is now impacting the ability of photic light to effectively hit the retina, activate those neurochemical pathways, and activate the circadian system. It adds complications to the problem. I mean, I believe just from the research we have, you can't cure jet lag. You will always have some lingering effects of jet lag, whether it's grave or small. But where you can use caffeine is that next day, especially if you're doing west travel to east travel, you take a red eye, you stay up, you're on the new time zone, and you have to stay up that whole day to then fall asleep at night so you can sleep through the night. That's where caffeine's effective, is helping you get through that first horrible day.
So coming back to that then, there's a lot of information about when to use caffeine in the day. And there's certain influencers around, don't use it in the morning. It's doing this and that to this certain hormone or that certain hormone. If we purely look at the effect of caffeine on circadian rhythm entrainment, or what you were just talking about with the light hitting the retina, going into that circadian master clock, the suprachiasmatic nuclei, is there something in that? Is caffeine in the morning affecting the quality of that light as an entrainment factor, or is it all absolute nonsense?
It's nonsense if your entrained clock is entrained. Light is the most potent time cue for the body. If you're getting the light exposure, caffeine's going to have minimal effect because your body is going to accept the light because it predicts it will have the light. The only time that perhaps caffeine could potentially disrupt this photic time cue would be traveling, right? Because you're getting light at an unpredicted circadian time. But if your circadian clock is in lockstep, I think that research is bullshit, to be honest with you. If you look at that study, they had to abstain from caffeine use for 5 days, and then the effect was abolished the second day of caffeine exposure. So that isn't applicable to real life because who's doing that, right?
That's music to my ears again, because I like coffee in the morning. And I know lots of people who are listening to this podcast who get fueled up on caffeine first thing.
Right.
They do ask me that. They listen to an influencer, don't take caffeine for however many hours after you've woken up. And I often say to them, I don't think that's true. But now I'm just going to quote you. So I'll just say, listen to this podcast. We've got a real expert who can tell you that it's
bullshit.
You can use those words. Erroneous information.
Yeah. In my world, when you're going to work in the morning, at least in the US, most military bases are in remote places, especially the large training bases. And it's this single dangerous one-way road. And unfortunately, at Fort Bragg, for example, we have too many deaths on this road. Once every 2 weeks, a soldier's dying going to work in the morning. I think it was last Christmas, we had 3 deaths in 1 week. It was actually 3 deaths from the same battalion in 1 week on this road. And so I always say caffeine in those sense could be the difference between life and death because they're going to work already sleep deprived. They're trying to rush to get there because they have to be there for unit PT in the morning. And we could have a whole separate podcast about there's no need, I think, to work out early in the morning with PT. But that could be the difference between life and death in those populations and then in first responder.
Talking about supplements and again, BS, what's your thoughts on magnesium? Is it effective or is it just complete snake oil?
There's at least 2 papers that have shown evidence for magnesium bicarbonate to help with sleep continuity, but in those situations, it was more for people who presented things like restless legs. So it's improving sleep continuity through the act of reducing the feeling of periodic limb movements and restless legs. Those are the 2 papers that I at least know of.
Awesome. What we like to do on the podcast is to offer it back to you to close it up for us. This can be anything you want, really. Most people will talk about something that they want to reinforce or reiterate, or maybe they introduce something new that they maybe haven't talked about yet, just to wrap us up. So over to you to wrap it up for us. How do you want to close off?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reiterate that sleep deprivation does kill. And it's one of those things like, yeah, sure, we might all have jobs where sometimes sleep deprivation is inevitable, but it's those things on the front end that matter. So making sure that your sleep leading up to anticipated periods of sleep deprivation is protected. And you're taking that opportunity not to get in a few extra workouts or stay up late playing video games, but you're actually genuinely trying to focus on your sleep, just like you've been genuinely focused on your training for whatever you're doing. And then don't be afraid to be vulnerable. We all experience sleep deprivation. It's not a badge of honor. And in those situations, that's where caffeine and stimulants are the way to go.
Great stuff. Love that. If people want to read your research, learn anything about you, is there any way of them following you online?
Yeah. So as you know, I do have a popular science book. It's called Meathead: Unraveling the Athletic Brain. It focuses more on like the neuroscience of athleticism and how people grow from being an amateur athlete all the way up to an elite athlete and the neurobiology of that. But I do have a chapter in there on sleep and fatigue management for athletes and high performing populations. So you can find that book on Amazon, and then I guess online I'm on Instagram. DocJockZZZ is my Instagram handle. So
Great handle. Awesome. Allison, thank you very much. Have a great day.
of course, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, mate.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.